Hollywood, California.
September 14, 1982. The call time was 6 o'clock in the morning. Stage 7 at Paramount Pictures smelled like fresh paint and old ambition. The kind of smell that clings to soundstages built in the 1940s. Decades of dreams soaked into the walls, the ceiling beams, the concrete floor.
40 crew members moved through the controlled chaos of a morning setup.
Grips adjusted lighting rigs.
A script supervisor reviewed pages with a red pen.
Someone was arguing quietly near the catering table about whether the coffee was strong enough.
Phoebe Cates was 18 years old.
She had been in Hollywood for exactly 11 months. Long enough to understand the hierarchy. Long enough to know which conversations she was supposed to stay out of. Long enough to sense when she walked onto a set how people looked at her. Not at her exactly, but at the idea of her, the face, the body. The image that had already been decided before she opened her mouth. She sat in the makeup chair at 6:15, watching herself disappear into someone else's version of her, and thought about the drama classes she had taken at the professional children's school in New York. Her teachers there had talked about character, about truth, about finding the specific human logic inside every scene. Nobody on this set had talked to her about any of that. But she told herself, today would be different.
Today she had prepared.
She had stayed up until 2 o'clock in the morning with the script, breaking down her scenes, finding the internal life of her character, building something real underneath the surface the camera would capture. She had notes. She had questions.
She was ready.
She didn't know yet that none of it would matter to the man who was about to walk through that door. His name was Richard Calloway, 47 years old, 17 years in the industry. 3 studio credits, 2 of them profitable. He had directed music videos before features, which meant he understood visual composition the way a photographer understands it, as a problem of light and geometry, not as a problem of human truth.
His name never appeared on lists of great directors,
but it appeared regularly on studio memos as reliable and on schedule and easy to work with, which in the language of 1982 Hollywood meant he did what the studio wanted without complaint, and he kept the trains running.
He walked onto stage 7 at 6:47, 12 minutes before the first shot was scheduled,
carrying a coffee and a rolled-up shot list.
He was a compact man,
the kind who moved through spaces like he owned them, who spoke in the tone of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room.
He glanced at Phoebe in the makeup chair,
didn't say good morning, moved directly to his director's chair and began conferring with the cinematographer. The first hour went smoothly enough, establishing shots, coverage that didn't require much from the actors. Phoebe hit her marks, took direction, smiled when she was supposed to smile. Then came scene 14. Scene 14 was the scene Phoebe had spent most of those late-night hours preparing. Her character, a young woman navigating the dissolution of her parents' marriage, had a pivotal moment of realization in this scene. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a breakdown. It was subtler than that. A shift in understanding that had to live entirely in her face, in the quality of her stillness, in what she chose not to say. It was the kind of scene that separated actresses from personalities. The kind of scene that required something true. Phoebe knew exactly what she wanted to do with it. She waited until the lighting was set, until the camera was in position, until the crew had settled into the focused quiet that precedes a take. Then she approached Calloway. She did it respectfully. She waited until he had finished his conversation with the AD. She didn't interrupt. She said, "Excuse me." All the right things. "I've been thinking about this scene," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced being steady. "I think there's something interesting happening underneath the surface here. Something about the way she's been protecting herself emotionally, and I want to make sure that comes through. Can I show you what I'm thinking?"
Calloway looked at her.
Really looked at her for what felt like the first time that morning. Something shifted in his expression, not hostility exactly, but a kind of recalibration. Like a man recategorizing information that didn't fit the file he'd already created. "That's not what I need from you in this scene," he said. "I understand, but I think if we..." "Phoebe." He said her name the way adults say the names of children who have interrupted something important, patient. Final. Here's what I need you to do in this scene. I need you to stand in the light, hit your mark, and let the camera do the work. That's it. That's your job today. She waited. There was still a chance this was going somewhere reasonable. It wasn't. He turned to the cinematographer, not back to Phoebe, to the cinematographer, as if she had already been dismissed, and said, loud enough for the entire crew to hear, "Beautiful girls don't need to think on camera. They just need to stand there and be beautiful." That's what the audience is paying for. 40 people heard it. The grip nearest to Phoebe's left shoulder went very still. The script supervisor looked up from her pages. The makeup artist, who had spent 45 minutes that morning making Phoebe look like someone the camera would love, stared at a point on the floor somewhere between herself and the craft services table. Nobody said anything. Calloway moved on immediately, talking shot ratios with the cinematographer, as if the previous 30 seconds had been as unremarkable as a weather report. Phoebe stood where she was for a moment. She was 18 years old. She had been in Hollywood for 11 months. She knew the hierarchy. She knew which conversations she was supposed to stay out of. She knew that the correct response to what had just happened, the industry-approved, career-protecting, don't-make-waves response, was to smile. Hit her mark and let the camera do the work, exactly as she had been instructed. She also knew something else. Something that had been forming slowly over 11 months of makeup chairs and shot lists and conversations about her face that never included her. Something that had been forming since the first time a producer looked through her rather than at her. Something that had finally, in the past 30 seconds, finished forming completely. She was not going to do that. She walked to her bag, picked it up, put on her jacket. Thea noticed first. "Phoebe, we're about to go for a take." "I know," she said. Her voice was completely calm. "I need 5 minutes." She walked off the set. But here's what nobody expected. And this is the part that changes everything. She didn't go to the parking lot. She didn't call her agent in tears. She didn't sit in her car and cry, and then come back 20 minutes later pretending nothing had happened. Which is what everyone assumed she was doing during those 5 minutes. Which is what almost every young actress in Hollywood would have done in 1982. Because what other choice was there? She walked to the production office. The production coordinator, a woman named Sandra Rice, 34 years old, 12 years in the industry, a person who had heard 1,000 versions of what had just happened on stage 7 and had learned to absorb them all without expression, looked up when Phoebe walked in. "I need to speak to the line producer," Phoebe said. "Right now." Sandra looked at her for a long moment. Something in Phoebe's face, not anger, not tears, just absolute clarity, made Sandra pick up the phone. The line producer was a man named Gerald Park. He arrived in the production office 4 minutes later, coffee in hand, already wearing the expression of someone braced for a talent problem. Phoebe told him exactly what had happened, not emotionally, not dramatically, chronologically, specifically with the exact words Calloway had used, in the exact order he had used them, in front of the exact number of people who had heard them. Then she said, "I'm not going back on that set today." Gerald started to speak. "I'm not finished," Phoebe said, still calm. "I'm not going back on that set today, and I want it on record that I've reported this to you directly. Right now, at 8:52 in the morning on September 14th, I want you to know that I intend to finish this film, professionally and completely. But I will not be directed by someone who has made it clear that my only function on this set is decorative. That's not what I signed my contract for. And I don't think it's what the studio signed their contract for either." Gerald Park had been in the industry for 19 years. He had dealt with talent problems ranging from genuine emergencies to elaborate tantrums. He was very good at reading the difference. He looked at Phoebe Cates, 18 years old, sitting across from him with her hands folded on the desk, speaking in complete sentences, having just walked off an active set with zero drama and come directly to him with a formal complaint, and he made a decision. He picked up the phone. The shoot was suspended for the rest of that morning. Calloway spent 90 minutes in a closed-door meeting with Gerald Park and the studio's legal representative. Nobody on the crew was told exactly what was discussed. What they were told at 11:15 a.m. was that there had been a creative and professional disagreement, and that adjustments to the production's leadership structure would be made over the following 24 hours. By the following morning, a new director was on set. Calloway was reassigned to a smaller project, a direct-to-video production that nobody would ever speak of in the same sentence as his name again. Within 2 years, he had left studio productions entirely. He spent the rest of the decade directing commercials and industrial training videos. His name disappeared from the conversation. Phoebe Cates went back to work. She hit her marks. She delivered her scenes. She did the things she had been hired to do. And in scene 14, the scene she had prepared for, the scene with the specific internal logic and the shift in understanding that lived entirely in her face, she did exactly what she had told Calloway she wanted to do. The new director watched the playback on the monitor after the take. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That's it. That's exactly it. Let's move on." Nobody wrote about it at the time. In 1982, a teenage actress walking off a set and having a director removed was not the kind of story that appeared in Variety. It was the kind of story that circulated in production offices and over late dinners and in the particular shorthand that crew members use when they are describing something they witnessed that they know they shouldn't have witnessed. It lived in the way Sandra Rice told it to a friend who told it to a colleague who filed it away in the part of her memory reserved for things that mattered. It was not a public story, but it was a true one. And true stories have a way of finding the surface eventually. If you've ever been told that what you think doesn't matter, that your job is to show up and look the part, keep reading. Because what happened next is the part that took 20 years to fully understand. In 1988, 6 years after Stage 7, Phoebe Cates sat across from an interviewer and said something that most people in Hollywood heard as a confession and only a few understood as a diagnosis. "I've only felt happy as an actress for about 2 years, she said. I rarely watch my film work." The interviewer moved on quickly. The quote was printed in a small box on page 34 of the magazine, the kind of placement reserved for color and texture, not for meaning. Most people read it as the charming candor of a beautiful young woman who was modest about her talent. That was not what it was. It was the precise articulation of a problem that had been building since September 14, 1982. Since before that, even. Since the first time someone looked at Phoebe Cates and decided, without asking her, what she was for. The problem was not that she was a bad actress. She knew she wasn't. She had been told by people whose judgment she trusted that she had something real, something that worked on camera for reasons that had nothing to do with her face. The problem was that Hollywood had never been particularly interested in that thing. What Hollywood was interested in was the other thing. The image, the swimsuit. The slow-motion emergence from the pool that had been playing in the dreams of every teenage boy in America since the summer of 1982. That thing was enormously valuable to a great number of people in the industry, and those people had structured everything. The scripts, the roles, the interviews, the photo shoots, the entire architecture of her public existence around preserving and monetizing that thing. The actual person inside the image had been, from the industry's perspective, largely beside the point. But here is what the industry did not anticipate. The actual person had opinions about that. The offers kept coming through the late 1980s, each one a variation on the same theme. Beautiful girl, desirable object. The one everyone wants. Phoebe read them all. Turned down most of them. Accepted a handful. The ones where the character had an interior life, where the writing gave her something to actually do, where she felt, even briefly, like a person rather than a prop. She was increasingly difficult to satisfy, according to the people who were trying to hire her. Their frustration was genuine. They had given her what she was supposed to want. Fame, money, the cover of every magazine. The dreams of a generation. Why wasn't it enough? The answer was so simple it was almost invisible. Because none of it had anything to do with her. In 1989, she met a casting director named Louise Farrow at a dinner party in Beverly Hills. Louise had been in the industry for 25 years. She had cast films that mattered and films that didn't and had developed over that time. The particular clarity of vision that comes from spending a career watching people be seen and not seen simultaneously. She and Phoebe ended up talking for 3 hours at a table in the corner of the party, long after most of the other guests had migrated to the garden or gone home. At some point, Phoebe couldn't remember exactly when, the conversation had moved through too many territories to track. Louise said something that Phoebe wrote down the next morning in the journal she kept on her nightstand. The industry gives you an identity before you're old enough to know you don't have to accept it. The ones who survive really survive. Not just career survive, are the ones who figure that out before it costs them everything. Phoebe looked at that sentence for a long time. Then she wrote underneath it, in her own handwriting, already cost me something. Still figuring out what. She met Kevin Kline in 1989. They were married in 1989. Their first child was born in 1991. And something happened. Not immediately, not in a single moment, but slowly. The way the most important changes always happen. Something shifted. She started to understand the difference between a life that was being watched and a life that was being lived. The first kind was the one the industry had built for her. It had a shape and a narrative and a specific visual quality. It was comprehensible from the outside. People could discuss it and judge it and feel things about it. It required her to show up and be present in the way that objects are present, available to be looked at, available to carry the meaning that other people assigned to her. The second kind was harder to describe. It happened in her kitchen and in her children's rooms and in conversations that nobody was recording. It didn't have a narrative shape. It wasn't comprehensible from the outside. It asked her to be present in the way that people are present, chaotic and interior and impossible to fully see. She knew which one she wanted. In 1994, Phoebe Cates made her last film. She didn't announce it as her last film. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't write an essay about her decision for a magazine. She simply finished the work she had committed to, came home, and stopped accepting new projects. Hollywood spent several years waiting for her to come back. When she didn't, the conversation shifted, as it always shifts. As it is designed to shift to the next image, the next face, the next girl who would stand in the light and let the camera do the work. The machine moved on. Phoebe opened a clothing store in New York called Blue Tree, on the Upper East Side, near her home, near her children's schools. Small, carefully curated. A place where the work was about objects, yes, but objects chosen for reasons that were entirely her own. People who visited the store described the same thing consistently, across years of testimonials. The specific quality of the quiet inside it, like a place that had opted out of some ambient noise that most places don't even know they're producing. A journalist who profiled the store in 2005, a small piece, the kind reserved for human interest stories without obvious stakes, asked Phoebe what she missed about acting. Phoebe thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "The 2 years when I felt like I was actually doing it." The journalist asked what she meant. "There were about 2 years," Phoebe said, "when I was young enough to not know yet what the industry wanted from me, and good enough to actually do what the work required. Those 2 years were real. Everything else was management." The journalist didn't know about September 14th, 1982, didn't know about Stage 7, about Scene 14, about a director who said beautiful girls don't need to think on camera and discovered, at 8:52 in the morning, in a production office from an 18-year-old who spoke in complete sentences, that he was wrong. But everything Phoebe said in that 2005 interview connected back to that morning. Every decision she had made since then, every role turned down, every offer declined, every gradual step toward the life that was hers rather than the one the industry had assigned her, had its root in that specific moment of clarity. She had been told in front of 40 people that her only function was to be beautiful. She had walked off the set. She had ended a director's career not through anger, not through a public statement, not through the machinery of scandal, but through the simple, devastating act of refusing to accept the premise. And then she had spent the next 12 years figuring out what she actually was, underneath the image. And then she had chosen that thing, quietly, without ceremony, and built a life around it. 20 years after Stage 7, a woman named Hennessey, who had been a camera operator on that Paramount production in 1982, who had been one of the 40 people who heard Richard Calloway say what he said, who had spent the next 2 decades in the industry watching versions of that scene repeat themselves on set after set, gave an interview to a documentary filmmaker working on a project about women in Hollywood. The filmmaker asked her about defining moments that changed how she understood the industry. Carol described September 14, 1982, Stage 7, Scene 14. The silence after Calloway spoke. The moment Phoebe picked up her bag. The 5 minutes that followed. I had been on probably 60 sets before that day, Carol said. I had seen that thing happen. That specific thing. A man telling a young woman that her job was to be looked at and nothing else. I had seen it happen so many times that I had stopped registering it as remarkable. It was just the weather. It was just how things were. She paused. And then this 18-year-old girl picked up her bag and walked off the set, not crying, not making a speech, just done. And in 4 minutes, she had the line producer on the phone, and in 24 hours, she had a different director. And I remember thinking, it was always that simple. You just had to be the person who did it. The filmmaker asked if she had ever told Phoebe Cates about the impact that morning had on her. No, Carol said. I never did. I always thought I would, and I never did. But I changed how I worked after that day. I stopped absorbing those moments as weather. I started naming them. And naming them changed what I was willing to tolerate. And I think about that a lot. How she didn't know she was doing any of that. She was just an 18-year-old girl who decided she wasn't going to stand there and be beautiful. She had no idea 40 people were watching. She had no idea any of us would carry it. She just did the thing that needed to be done. That is the real story of September 14th, 1982. Not that Phoebe Cates ended a director's career, though she did. Not that she stood up to a system that had decided her value before she was old enough to contest it, though she did that too. The real story is what happens when a person refuses to become the thing the world has decided they are. The real story is the 40 people who watched it happen and filed it away in the part of their memory reserved for things that mattered. The real story is Hennessey changing how she worked. The real story is every young woman who ever walked onto a set and was told in whatever words that her job was to stand in the light and let the camera do the work, and needed to see, even once, even from a distance, that there was another option. Phoebe Cates was 18 years old. She had been in Hollywood for 11 months. She picked up her bag and walked off the set. She never looked back. And the director who told her that beautiful girls don't need to think on camera spent the rest of his career making industrial training videos, which is perhaps the most fitting conclusion a story like this could have. Some lessons cost nothing. Some cost a career. Richard Calloway learned which kind this was on September 14, 1982, at approximately 8:47 in the morning, on Stage 7 at Paramount Pictures. 40 people heard him make that mistake. Only one of them walked off the set. But she was the only one who needed to. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been in a room where someone decided what you were before you could tell them who you are, like and subscribe. Every week we tell the stories of people who refuse to become the image the world assigned them. Those are the stories worth telling.